I don't want people to read the book and pity North Koreans. I want people to read the book and understand North Koreans.
Hello and welcome to this special audio edition of DailyNK. I'm Jonathan Corrado, reporting from Seoul. I recently sat down with James Pearson, co-author of the book North Korea Confidential. The book explores how the government, economy, and daily life of everyday North Koreans was turned completely upside down by a nationwide famine. With an entire population unable to rely on the state, a bottom-up system of black markets, bribery, and rugged individualism took hold. James Pearson is a foreign correspondent for Reuters in Seoul. He covers politics and general news in North and South Korea. We recently got together to talk about the book. Please enjoy these highlights from that conversation. The literature on North Korea is crowded with defector stories and Kim family tell-alls. But what Mr. Pearson and his co-author have laid to print is a horse of a different color. In light of this, my first question for Mr. Pearson was why he thinks the world needs to know about the daily lives of ordinary North Koreans.
There are certain kinds of books which dominate the North Korean book market. There are nuclear-focused ones. There are propaganda-focused ones. There are Kim family-focused ones too.
Right.
North Korean propaganda itself is so full of things about the Kim family. The last thing we need to know is the last thing I think people really want to read about is more Kim history. Right? It is interesting, and there's a market for it, and those books should exist. But they don't do a very good job of explaining what it's like to live in North Korea today. What does it feel like to be in North Korea? And contrary to as you mentioned, the idea of these mindless automatrons, contrary to many of the cliches which are peddled about North Korea, it should go without saying, but nevertheless I feel compelled to always point out that North Koreans, like anyone else, fall in out of love, they fight, they cheat on each other, they help each other, they have fun, they get drunk, they make their own booze. It is a country. It's definitely the case that the more eccentric, bizarre, freakish elements of North Korea are very attractive to a mainstream audience, right? The fact that this odd post-Soviet state still somehow exists, it's like a time machine or something.
So given that people's tastes are for the weird and the strange, how do you sort of bring that down and say, okay, look, yeah, that exists too, but those are the outliers. This is where the meat of the story is. This is how everyday people are living.
Yeah.
How do you sort of deal with, that's what people want to read, but maybe it's not what they need to read?
Well, for one thing, I think it absolutely is what they need to read, right? I think it is what they should be reading. And what we're trying to do is get beyond that, taking the as we've just discussed, the dominant wisdom being that this is this messed up, crazy state.
Right.
Let's put all that to one side and actually try and find out what it's actually like to live there, what do they actually have to deal with on a daily basis. And there are enough books out there which deal with North Korea, the state, in terms of, on a state level, that we don't need another one. There's nothing up to date on the market that really tells you this is what it's like to live in North Korea. And I think there's enough momentum these days, there is enough demand that we can move beyond these kind of images of military parades and goose-stepping soldiers and things to actually try and find out, well, actually underneath all this, there's this remarkable country with these remarkable people and who, despite all the oppression and demands of the state, live very normal lives.
Most people have become all too familiar with the flashing images of goose-stepping DPRK soldiers and ballistic missiles being carted out on the news. But the spotlight rarely falls upon the average North Korean person. I asked Mr. Pearson how he hopes to change that with this book.
In terms of selling, newsflash, North Koreans are normal people too. That's a tough sell, right? It's that's not the headline, but that's where good journalists can come in and say, okay, here's your advert for this country. Here's this crazy state you've heard about. By the way, this is how people actually live. And one of the issues I think is that in order to paint the kind of picture of North Korea that we've painted in that book. You have a very slow trickle of information that comes out and eventually contributes to a large thing. And even with little scoops that the likes of the DailyNK gets, they are not news per se, they are incremental developments, they are they are often very late because the information takes a while to
but it's news because no one else knows it yet outside of the country. But it's not necessarily new.
Right, exactly. And the thing is that is not. But none of those things are going to be front page news stories because they don't upset stock markets and they don't. You know, it's a different. It's of less importance to the wider world. It's going to be very, very difficult to stop politicians, journalists, diplomats, and indeed the general public from being concerned or worried about or wanting to know about North Korea when it starts to get blustery. But that actually gives us a really, really good platform from which to actually sell the other side of the story, which is the story.
Once you get their attention, then give them. You know.
North Korea is in the news all the time. There's not really much we can do about that because of the nature of the country, because of the nature of Northeast Asia. But as long as it is there, then I think certainly good journalists and people, good academics too, within the field, should be using that to responsibly tell the real story of what's going on for the people and not the state.
My next question, actually something you brought up just a minute or two ago, about how there's sort of a cleavage in the literature between like Nothing to Envy and like there's novels like Gia and Orphan Master's Son that are very personal stories and emotional, heartfelt, that sort of thing. And then on the other hand, you get these giant tomes that are just like comprehensive, but so huge they're very intimidating. And they can be a little cold and a little, you know, statistical, fact heavy. But I think what you guys tried to do was sort of have personal interest stories, but also give like an overview. So my question is, did you purposely try to set out that tone? Did you purposely see, oh, there's a need for this, we have to write this kind of book?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm really glad that you picked up on that because, there is absolutely a need for I don't really know how else to describe this, but someone just to write about this normally. Some academics are fantastic, but many do a very good job of taking a very simple concept and making it extremely inaccessible.
Sure.
And that's exactly what we didn't want to do. There is a place in the book market and there is a place in the field of North Korea studies for personal defector memoirs and personal stories and things. But they come with their own bias and they come with their own perspective.
Yeah.
And what and as we've seen recently, that's on occasions can be an issue.
Very contentious.
Right.
And the readers of North Korea stuff tend to be really ready to raise their hand and say, no, that's not how it went down.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's not exactly. And at the same time, the defectors and a lot of the sources that maybe you have used have a very, very real and understandable incentive to just tweak things a little bit.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's not, that's not incomprehensible. But you have to wonder, like, because after we've taken all of these sources that, how many people are just tweaking things just a little bit out of necessity, and then how does that affect our overall picture of what's going on here?
Absolutely. I mean, beyond book sales, we have no real personal incentive to change any of our stories. Right? What we want to do is just say, this is how we see it. We want to be able to write well as well, right? We've got our own journalistic reputations to protect too.
Sure.
There is a tendency with the defector memoir or with defector-led memoirs there's a tragedy in the stories, right? Because the stories are tragic. I mean, and which is totally fine, and as I say, that should absolutely be a part of the book market. But I don't always know how helpful that is in terms of helping people on the outside understand North Korea, because we don't actually want to just pity people.
Sure.
Some people live comparatively normal lives in North Korea. They have fun. They also live through tragedy. What we really didn't want to do is write an exhausting account of how terrible people's lives have been. We wanted to say very clearly, this is how awful the famine was, this is how bad people's lives can be. But we also wanted to be able to say, and on top of that, point out that this is this prison system, this is how it works, this is why it's so awful. But on top of that, say, but this is people have fun, this is how they have fun, this is how they make their own booze. And it's sad to say, but I can't think of many books which have done that yet in the field, and I hope more will come. I don't think it's always helpful to have something which just pours constant pity into these people's stories.
Sure.
And I think that there's some of the stories are tragic, and you can describe them in very non-emotive terms and that tragedy is very easily apparent. Some of the stories are entertaining, some of them are fun. It's just like any other place. They don't. North Koreans do not all think with one mind, despite what the propaganda says about single-hearted unity. These differences exist. I don't want people to read the book and pity North Koreans. I want people to read the book and understand North Koreans.
So is that the overall takeaway that you want readers to bring home after they finish this book?
If people can read this book and grow closer to North Koreans, not because they have pity for them and they sympathise with them, but because they actually understand that they are more like them, then that would be one of many good achievements we'd like to achieve there. The other thing, in very simple terms, is we'd just like to try and explain how money works in North Korea and how the economy works. Not in a kind of baffling economist's way, but in a very, very simple way, in that there's a real market, there's an unofficial market, and if you understand that, you can understand why X, Y, and Z, why there's a market for fashion, why there's a market for anything, why you can bribe your way in and out of things despite this social class system. Those are the things that we want people to really take away, I think.
So one of the book's central motifs is, in the wake of the famine, after the Arduous March, an entirely new system rises up. And a lot of this change is driven from the bottom up. In terms of just market liberalization, in terms of people not trusting the government, that sort of feeling of loyalty, which was like a genuine feeling before the famine. Total loss of trust in the government altogether. And then so you have the government sort of making these reforms, but then cracking down. Economic crackdowns, border crackdowns, the 2009 redenomination, which you talked about. And it sort of is becoming cyclical. So my question is, like, these two worlds, they seem to be coming closer together, right? Especially if we go back before the famine. It seems like things are much improved. But now it seems like there's definitely a cycle coming into place. You have a line about this in the book. I thought it was a really excellent line and summed it up excellently, which is that the government is going to allow just enough reform so that they have their hand in everyone's pockets. But they're not doing it for the sake of their people. They're doing it for their own interests. So my question is sort of, do you see this cycle repeating infinitively, or is this going to hit the wall? What's going to happen?
I don't know if I would describe it as a cycle. I think I would describe it as more of a frustrating progression, but a progression nonetheless, right? I mean, it's undeniable that, as you said and as we say in the book, the famine and subsequently the currency devaluation were two extremely important catalysts for cementing the unofficial economy, right? And as you say, it broke that trust. That's the important thing, right? It broke the trust between the people and the government. People learned they can't trust the government with food during the famine, and then they learned they can't trust the government with money. So they keep their money elsewhere, right? It's so fascinating and it's so important, and despite all that tragedy, especially in the famine, it's incredible what's come out of it. But I don't see it as a cycle. I don't see it necessarily as rising up. I'm trying to think of it might feel like a cycle, right? It might feel like peaks and troughs, but I think the trend is still one of progression, right? Because we're even though it's become harder to defect recently, for example, and even though there's bigger crackdowns on information, and the government, by the way, I think is going to become a lot more repressive over time, because as long as people are no longer worried about where their next meal is going to come from, they're going to want more economic freedoms, right?
That seems to be their number one goal.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, which is strange. So, we wonder, why don't these people want more liberties? Why don't they care about their own human rights? And maybe they don't know what human rights are. They grew up in this system.
I think that's absolutely the case. I agree. I don't think everyone's number one priority is a better understanding of human rights or better human rights. I think people, of course, they actually absolutely have that. Right. People are more concerned with making more money or being allowed to make more money. Right. So we're going, like in China, we'll see very, very, very slow and gradual, maybe even no political reform. but we'll see slowly, I think, economic reform. And the recent measures we see the government trying to introduce do sort of reflect this. The things they're trying to struggle with, right? For example, how do you incentivize a workforce that has in a state economy that is extremely unproductive because your wages are so meaningless because you're paid not according to the free market rate or whatever you want, something, you have to allow them to keep more of what they so we do see the government trying to accommodate this, right? But then there'll be like a big...
Not only accommodate it, they've sort of necessitated it by giving such low wages. It's impossible for the government now to exist without the black market, the grey market.
Precisely, and that's the key, right? Like it's impossible for the government to exist without it.
Right.
The question isn't how do they stop it or get rid of it. The question is how do they accommodate it.
Right.
And that's the slow cycle, right? Or the slow progression.
Yeah.
I don't think if it was a cycle, we'd be going back to like pre-famine North Korea, right? And it's never going to happen.
Yeah. I guess what I meant by cycle is not necessarily that it's going to return to its former state, but rather than I don't see an end game here. I don't see it. Where is the penultimate landing stage? I don't see it. It just.
Well, absolutely, yeah, of course. Well, we can't. Well, we don't know. We can predict and make a sensible prediction.
Right.
But we don't know. I think another thing to consider is that the people at the top who have the power to make the decisions, the right decisions that North Korea would benefit from, can't necessarily do that because they are most concerned, if it's not with making money, it's with their own security, right? One thing, as I said in the lecture last night, is that no self-respecting North Korean official wants to become a taxi driver in Seoul. Right? Not because there's anything wrong with becoming a taxi driver, but if you've lived the life of Riley in Pyongyang, in your nice apartment and had your Mercedes and things, and your state collapses...
They're terrified of the International Criminal Court.
Right, well,
They're terrified.
Yeah. But not even that. If for some reason they have to leave and that life of luxury is suddenly lost.
Right.
Or if the state collapses and, it's just... There are and I've had conversations with North Koreans in third countries about this, and they've said, but, I know what we have to do, but my biggest concern is my family, and so I'm going to get my head down and get on with it.
Okay, so now, out of the famine, we have the system where bribery is now just the de facto. That's how you play the game. Is there a way out of that, or is that just going...
Bribery I think is really interesting, and as we say in the book, it's quite an equalising force, right, bribery.
Right. As long as everyone's playing by the rules.
Yeah, as long as everyone's... Yeah, exactly.
You get people that... So, for example, there was a guard who was killed. He was a security guard for one of the markets. And, these security guards, they walk around the Jangmadang and they get their money, they get their piece. This guy was a little bit too eager, and they found him in an alley shot.
Really?
Yeah, and they returned the gun to the police station. Sorry, we killed this guy. Here's your gun back. And supposedly they don't pursue it. If you return the gun, they're less likely to pursue the crime. I found
that's odd. I've not heard that before. That's very interesting.
So I just read that.
Well, so that's really interesting. Well, that is exactly the point I was going to make, right? So for ordinary people, it's a real hassle, right? The fact that you don't know when you're going to have to pay the next bribe. You don't know how much it's going to be, and you're powerless to do it, right? And people really, really abuse it. But there is one effect of it which is really interesting, which is rarely focused on, in that it's, socially speaking, a very equalising thing. Because regardless of your songbon, if you have money, you can very often pay your way into places where...
Hence the middle class, maybe, potentially.
Yeah. You can, suddenly that university place might come up for grabs that you wouldn't have been able to go anywhere near based on your social class, right?
So how much has the bribery sort of replaced someone for...
Well, that's the $1,000,001 question, right? That's a really interesting question. I mean, it hasn't... So, politically speaking, probably not very much, right? Because politics in North Korea still relies on that.
Right.
Economically speaking, then...
Right.
Yeah.
But now politics and religion, politics and economy have become so in bed with one another. A lot of these departments, if they don't make money, then that's it. You just go under. So I read the other day that in the 90s, even like the library, the agency required that was in charge of libraries, had to have its own business venture in order to get funds.
They all do. Yeah, they absolutely all do.
You think about libraries, that's the last thing that comes to mind. So now that being the case, might we see, the bribery system becoming even more important for political opponents?
Yeah, I would have thought it would be possible. I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I don't know. I don't know the answer. Theoretically, then yes, right? But because as you say, that part of the economy has become so strong.
Right.
But North Korean politics is, I don't know. If you were to rise in North Korean politics, you needed, of course, to rise throughout the party. And if you were trying to get into an extremely prominent position within the party, then your songwon is probably going to
you got to check out with the OGD
North Korea Confidential introduces a wide audience to a side of North Korea they never knew existed. Many readers, for example, will be surprised to learn about the widespread enjoyment of contraband foreign media, such as films and radio. The regime has always relied upon their iron-fisted network of informants, stemming from local communities and reaching to the top-ranking Worker Party officials, to prevent the flow and distribution of these materials. While it is hard to get a statistical picture, and though strict punishments like execution are still known to happen, more people are watching than ever before. I asked Mr. Pearson what conditions have made this possible.
Is the incidence of informants, tattling, going down? Because I've talked to some defectors and they say, during the famine, the government broke. And so the informant system also went with it. But within the last 10 years, it's still there, and of course, for certain things like watching dramas or what have you, that's a little bit more relaxed, and there's definitely some arenas which have opened up, which weren't there before. But informants are very much still a part of things.
It's not so much that the Stasi-esque network of informants has been replaced with something or doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
Where I think what we mean by that, where they lack influence, is where money has become more important, right? So as long as people can control things, like, again, money has acted as a kind of equalizer in society, right? So people have become more powerful. It's given them more agency, and when they've got more money to control their own fate, suddenly this network of informers, even if they know how many spoons and chopsticks you have or have your neighbour's door keys, are less powerful, right? So I think that's what we mean by that. It's not necessarily that the system itself has changed or these people don't wield the same power they had before. It's that from their perspective, from the Imanban's perspective, they are dealing with a new challenge, and that is the unofficial economy and the way that dictates things.
Right, and they got to get their piece too.
And then they've got to get their piece too.
Which is where the whole system has changed
because everybody is engaged in the unofficial economy in some way.
Sure.
Right. There are very few people who are not. In fact, I would struggle to think of an example of a North Korean who is not.
Yeah, your image of the Pyonghatanite drinking his cafe and doing the iPad. I think that's a good image for what is now what people aspire to. It's not the average North Korean in any regard, but it is what the new North Korean aspires to. It no longer means wearing Kim Jong-il's little funny green suit. It now looks like that, which is hugely different in a short period of time to make such a dramatic change. Or maybe that's another question. Was that desire there from the beginning? It just wasn't able to be expressed, and now people are able to sort of be more vocal about it? Or is this economic desire to move up the totem pole a factor of the new famine atmosphere, the post-famine atmosphere? Or is it just because people have wanted it all along and now finally they can get it?
The latter, I think. I mean, if you talk to people who travel regularly to North Korea, as I do often, so people involved in tourism, business people, NGOs, diplomats, and you ask them what are the biggest changes you've seen in the last 5 years, and don't say taxis, mobile phones, and the usual cliches, which are not cliches in fact, and they are a central part of our book, but for us as specialists in this field, it's kind of old news, right? The most interesting thing they always say is something along the lines of very conspicuous consumption of goods, of things.
And this isn't a change in ideology, it's rather just a change in their ability to actually consume. Or is it a change in ideology? That's what I was
maybe perhaps not saying clearly enough before, but that was what I was interested in.
I think it's a change in their ability to consume, for sure. They have the wherewithal to do it, and maybe they didn't have that before. There's also, but that's because so many people have made money in this unofficial way.
Right.
It's created a kind of momentum. It's not something I think they can stop.
Right.
They can control it, but it's not. It's going to manifest itself in lots of different ways, and the government's going to respond to it in different ways by trying to modernise it. Even you see that with its culture and art stuff, right? But it is really, really interesting. Yeah, it used to be the case that even traders and things, and they still do this, would hide their money, right? They hide it, not just from thieves, but they hide it. It's kind of not okay to have this huge stash of foreign currency, bury it in the kimchi pot, hide it under the bed, roll it up in the mattress, whatever. You know, it wasn't okay to be seen to flaunt any kind of wealth.
Yeah.
That's definitely changed a bit, right? The ones who had wealth before were usually the guys who had some sort of Japanese connection.
Right.
If they weren't already a top level official or something, right? And they were kind of allowed to do it. They were kind of allowed to live a life in North Korea that is a bit like the Dongju middle classes now.
Sure.
And everyone knew, it was like, oh, why so and so got like a nice car, or why have they got a car? It's like, oh, well, they've got an uncle in Japan, so something like that. But that sort of standard seems to apply to a lot more people now because this money is floating about, and rather than having it hidden under their kimchi pots, I think people are spending it. That's really interesting, and if they're spending it, that means there's a market for it, and that means we see things like coffee shops and pizza parlours, you know, cropping up even in Pyongyang at one end of things, and then at the other end of things we see new things appear in the black markets like hair dye and skinny jeans, you know, and then this becoming, you know, not okay. It's still like, it's skinny jeans where the bottom is like a bell bottom, so that if you wear a long coat you can hide the fact that you've got skinny jeans on. Or it's like, you know, hair dye that's just a slightly different shade of black or brown that you can kind of pretend is natural and bribe your way out of it. But
and you know, everything's entering the market these days. I heard an article that I translated yesterday was about how, so when you boil rice, there's that leftover like sloppy rice, and like just a little bit of rice burnt on the bottom, and that water, which is kind of thick. And restaurants used to sell that to people that would then feed it to pigs. It was like really good pig slop. And now wealthy individuals are starting to sell their leftover rice because they realize that it has value. Why throw it away? This thing has value. And you know, according to how rich the house is, that's how quality the pig feed will be.
That's a really good anecdote.
Yeah. So I mean, they used to even these wealthy families, they're perfectly willing to enter the market, but they're also afraid because if they get caught, a lot of them have political collections, what have you. So they're only doing business with people they trust.
Yeah.
And that's the most, inmec has become a really big part of someone's value. Songbun can almost be replaced by inmec in terms of the new economy. So how does this new system of trusting people work? How is that changed? How, you know, the number one cool person now has a lot of economic wealth and is also someone that you could deal with.
So you put it really well, right? It exists. Both already existed, but something's happened, right? So it used to be the case that somebody close to the party or with those political connections or economic political connections in the sense of, let's say, the Japanese connection, would be a good person to know. And now those people are still important, right? Let's not forget that. But people with money who you can trade with, who can hook you up with someone or that kind of thing, are also suddenly a lot more important. Again, it's an equalizer in society, isn't it? It means that it's not something that's about political loyalty, it's not something where you need to... What it's done is it hasn't removed that, you still need to be near to those arteries, those political arteries, but its economic ones now exist too. So again, it's giving people agency, which they didn't have before, which is the point we make in the book, right? That the money, in the sense, is helping people.
The government has thus far taken progressively optimistic views in the private sector, resulting in a sort of mutual dependence. But reforms have been followed by crackdowns, and no one doubts who ultimately steers the ship. For long-term financial success, the country will need to open up significantly, a prospect that fears the current regime. They use their monopoly on information distribution to inspire fear and whip up loyalty, but these systems will become fragile when exposed to the international community. So I asked Mr. Pearson how this might play out in the long run.
A sensible prediction would be that the government, over a long time, very, very long time, will have to accommodate this awkward relationship it has with the unofficial economy, deal with this new economic order that it has before it. And look at China. North Korea is not going to follow Chinese-style reforms anytime soon, right? There's always talk about that kind of thing happening, but it's kind of quite unlikely.
And in the meantime, the regime still vilifies the Chinese for going that route.
Well, yeah, exactly. Officially, they very much, and especially if you talk to loyalists.
And then they close their eyes and they go that way.
Exactly. But they don't want to do it exactly in the Chinese way. But the reason I'm saying that, I'm not raising this because I think North Korea is going to adopt Chinese-style reforms. Because I don't know if North Korea is going to adopt Chinese-style reforms. I would like it to, because it would be very interesting. The reason I make the point is that China changed very, very quickly in terms of its long history and things, but particularly with its long history of comparatively short history of the economic system it had since the People's Republic of China was formed. It changed in a way economically that rendered it almost unrecognizable to the China that Mao founded. But politically, Chairman Mao's portrait is still hanging over Tiananmen Square.
And Tiananmen Square is still unknown.
The Tiananmen Square massacre is referred to as an incident. Xi Jinping is, a dictator of sorts. He's absolutely a dictator, but it's still one-party rule. It's still, it's politically. Some things have changed, but the political structure is.
So you see that sort of model of
iron
grip, still politically iron grip.
Yeah.
And human rights developments, progress, slim to none.
Yeah.
But
increasing
economic.
Yeah.
So you'll forgive me for taking a bit of an academic perspective of just your analysis in the book, but it's definitely a bit Marxist in the term of being infrastructure, superstructure, that sort of relationship. You see things as flowing, social change as flowing through primarily economic change. So economic change then leads to everything else.
Not necessarily, but certainly driving a lot of it, yes.
Right. I mean, that's sort of the gist that I got from things. If I've mischaracterized it, then
that's fair.
Yeah. So the question is to do with ideology then. So we talked about how I asked you whether did people always want to be consumers, or did they just get the opportunity to? And you said, they got the opportunity. So that's going to be an interesting development in terms of ideology, how ideology also evolves along with, you say that the economy is certainly going to open up significantly in the road ahead. And it looks that way, right? But how will ideology be changed by the opening up of communications? And that's the regime, their political control, their tight political control has often depended upon their ability to control information networks. Now, if they can't control information networks, which, let's face it, if you're going to have an open economy, information has to open up. You need to communicate with people. That's one of the major things that the Doing Business in North Korean guys said they had a problem with, was not enough communication.
Yeah.
So now, as you open up the economy, you also open up the information systems, and now does that threaten their ability to control things politically?
Yes, it does. Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely does. And so what that would do, were it to happen, and it hasn't yet, and they're clearly not ready to deal with this yet, because all they are doing is just trying to crush any information as it comes in.
Right.
The question that raises is, from where would North Korea derive its legitimacy for the people, where would the state derive its legitimacy in that kind of case, right?
Right. If it can't inspire fear,
right,
what can it inspire?
So if the economy grows to an extent where it necessitates more information coming in and freer and open trade with the outside, which is what happened in China, then it can no longer rely on fear to oppress people. It can no longer rely on a very old-fashioned post-Soviet sort of, but post-Soviet, post-World War II kind of ideology to govern its people, and it can't rely on self-reliance. It can't use juche in that kind of way either. It can reshape it as it always has, right? But what are the easy things it could rely on? Well, one would be nationalism, which is what China has excelled at.
Right.
Right. How else has the Chinese Communist Party managed to still call itself communist yet do completely the opposite?
Right.
In terms of the economy.
I mean, that show of the 5,000 drummers in the opening ceremony of the Olympics was definitely this is the new China.
Yeah.
We're proud and we're Chinese and we're coming.
Well, funnily enough, that is the new China of them coming out, right? But nationalism is not the new China, right? China had always used nationalism. Any Chinese government ever always used nationalism to control its people. There's never been a stable change of power in China as well. It's always been a violent, bloody revolution when the new systems come in. But every single time, right, all the way back since like the Manchus, some sort of nationalist thing has been used to maintain control and legitimacy. And North Korea did exactly the same thing. So the anti-Japanese rhetoric is very nationalist. Right? The Brian Myers type stuff of like, they're pure people and this kind of thing is also very nationalist.
Right.
And that's not going to go anyway anytime soon. We saw South Korea transition from a dictatorship to a democracy, but nationalism is still very, very prominent. Sure. How would it maintain control in that situation? It would have to use do something like China. And this is where I think the similarities are in the China reform thing, right? It's not that North Korea is going to follow the same path as China, and it publicly doesn't want to, but privately it is, right? But it's going to want to use this new economic wealth and claim it for its own, take credit for it,
right,
and use that as their legitimacy upon which they found their rule and they can control things. And with that will probably come a lot of nationalism. And they could do that now if they wanted to and make things a lot easier for everyone, I'm sure. But they don't, because they have a sort of feudal monarchy kind of style at the very top where that kind of debate clearly doesn't happen.
Sure.
So I think it's not impossible. So bringing it back to ideology, realistically speaking, I think considering Chairman Mao's portrait still hangs above Tiananmen, the actual gate itself, and is on the money in China. That should give us quite a good indication of what kind of political change we could expect from the state if it is to allow this economic growth to continue. And as this economic growth continues, it's going to need to use it to legitimize its rule.
Interesting. I'll look forward to see if your prediction comes true. I think it's very reasonable. Yeah.
I think it's a reasonable prediction. Well, it's something that we're seeing happening now to an extent, right? The question is, how far will they take it?
Yeah. That's what will be interesting.
And that bit, I don't know. I can't predict that.
Sure.
Of course, but I can.
And what kind of time frame are we dealing with?
Who knows? Years, probably.
Yeah.
Another 15, 20 years, maybe.